In a time of prophets and kings, when new civilizations were just starting and big empires ruled, there lived a man whose story is hard to believe. Solomon, the son of Prophet David, was a king unlike any other. Even when he was young, he showed a level of intelligence and wisdom that was beyond what people thought possible. Smart people admired him, older people respected him, and young people wanted to be like him. But there was something more to him, something that made him different from even the wisest people of his time. God had blessed Solomon in a special way. It all started with a dream, a vision that took him to a place where anything was possible. In this dream, Solomon asked God for something that kings usually don't want. He didn't ask for riches or a long life. Instead, he asked for wisdom so he could make fair judgments. God was happy with Solomon's pure request and gave him not only wisdom, but also amazing gifts that no one before or after him would have. From that moment on, his life showed God's power and proved how someone can become great by serving something bigger than themselves. One morning, as the sun barely touched the golden fields of Solomon's kingdom, two women came to the palace. Their loud, desperate voices broke the peaceful morning, and their footsteps echoed as they were led through the grand halls to the throne room. The room was huge and decorated with detailed designs. It seemed to reflect the sunlight like it was a sky on earth. There, in the middle of the room, Solomon was waiting for them, sitting on his throne. The throne was elegant, not because it was flashy, but because it was perfectly designed. The women stood before him, each saying she was the mother of a baby that one of them was holding. They argued fiercely, both determined to win. Everyone watched the scene with concern, because they knew Solomon had to make a difficult decision. This was not a normal case. It was a test of Solomon's ability to find the truth. Solomon listened carefully, letting both women explain their sides. He didn't seem impatient or judgmental, just deeply focused. Finally, he spoke in a calm voice that filled the room. "Bring me a sword," he said. The command was shocking, and everyone went silent. A god brought a shiny sword, and Solomon said firmly, "Cut the child in half, and give one half to each of them." The harshness of his words made people gasp, but Solomon didn't move. One of the women nodded coldly. "So be it. If I can't have him, neither can she." But the other woman, with tears streaming down her face, fell to her knees. "No," she begged. "Let her have him. Just don't hurt him. Let him live." Solomon raised his hand to stop the guard and looked at the woman who had begged for the child's life. "You are his mother," he said with a smile that brightened the room, "because only a true mother would give up her own happiness to save her child's life." Solomon's decision not only solved the argument, but also deeply touched everyone who was there. It was more than just a fair judgment. It was a reminder that the truth always wins when people look for it with honesty and wisdom. "If I can't have him, neither can she." But the other woman, with tears streaming down her face, fell to her knees. "No," she begged, "let her have him. Just don't hurt him. Let him live." Solomon raised his hand to stop the guard and looked at the woman who had begged for the child's life. "You are his mother," he said with a smile that brightened the room, "because only a true mother would give up her own happiness to save her child's life." Solomon's decision not only solved the argument, but also deeply touched everyone who was there. It was more than just a fair judgment. It was a reminder that the truth always wins when people look for it with honesty and wisdom. As time went on, Solomon's special abilities became more and more obvious. He was not only a fair judge, but also someone who could talk to animals. One day, as he walked through a valley, he heard ants whispering. They saw his army coming and hurried to hide. warning each other about the danger. Solomon understood their language, so he stopped and told his men not to go any further. "Don't crush these little creatures as you march," he said, his voice full of kindness. His ability to understand animals was not just a gift. It showed his connection to all creation and his responsibility as God's servant to protect everything under his care. But it wasn't just animals that obeyed him. The Jinn, beings made of fire and wind, also followed his orders. Some of them had amazing powers and built palaces for Solomon that were beyond imagination, with glass roofs and pillars that seemed to reach the sky. The Jinn, even though they were powerful, respected Solomon's authority because they knew he was not just a king, but a prophet chosen by God. Solomon didn't use these gifts to make himself famous, but to do what God wanted him to do. He knew that every ability was a gift from God, and that he would be held accountable for how he used them. His humility, even with his great power, was one of his best qualities. When the Queen of Sheba received Solomon's invitation, she was intrigued not just by the message, but by the respectful and wise tone of his words. She had heard stories about the king who controlled the winds and talked to animals, but she was most interested in his devotion to one God. She decided to make the journey, bringing with her many riches, not to show off her power, but to test the wisdom of the man everyone was talking about. When she arrived in Solomon's kingdom, she was amazed to see his throne, which a Jinn had brought from her land in an instant. But what really impressed her was how clearly and deeply Solomon spoke about truth and justice. He wasn't arrogant, just genuinely wanting to share the message of unity and devotion to God. The Queen of Sheba was deeply moved and recognized Solomon's greatness not only as a ruler, but as a servant of a higher power. Their meeting was not about one being better than the other, but about learning from each other and discovering the beauty of truth and divine wisdom. Solomon looked at the Queen of Sheba with a calm respect that showed his confidence. It was a special moment when two powerful and wise rulers met, not to compete, but to learn from each other. The queen, known for her intelligence, had come with difficult questions to see if Solomon was as wise as people said. But from the beginning, Solomon's presence made her question her approach. He wasn't trying to prove he was better. His wisdom came from a purer place, a connection with God that she couldn't ignore. For days, the Queen of Sheba asked her questions, some about philosophy, others about practical matters, and even some that seemed impossible to answer. If a river flows between two mountains and no one can cross it, how can someone get its water? Solomon replied with a calm smile, "Send a bird with an empty beak. It will come back with enough water to satisfy your thirst." The answer was simple, but taught a deeper lesson. Even the biggest challenges can be overcome with cleverness and patience. The queen was fascinated by Solomon's answers, but she was most surprised by his character. Despite his amazing gifts, he was humble and always gave credit to God. "Everything you see here, all my wisdom and my kingdom, are just signs of my Creator's mercy," he would say. And with each day, the queen found herself more willing to accept the truth Solomon offered, the worship of one God, the source of all wisdom and power. When it was time for her to leave, the Queen of Sheba was changed. She carried in her heart a new understanding that would forever change how she saw the world. "Your wisdom reflects the power of your God," she said before leaving. And with those words, she recognized not only Solomon's greatness, but the truth of divine unity. As the years went by, Solomon's gifts continued to appear in ways that astonished his people. Sometimes the wind carried him across vast deserts, as if nature itself was helping him in his mission. Other times the Jinn built structures that seemed to defy the laws of physics, like the magnificent palace, with a crystal floor so clear that visitors thought it was water. Each wonder was a lesson, a reminder that power and ability were not goals in themselves, but tools to serve God and humanity. Yet, Solomon still faced challenges. Despite his great power, he knew that everything he had was temporary, a gift from God. There were times when the Jinn, despite their obedience, tried to use their strength to cause trouble. Solomon, always watchful, used his wisdom to keep things in balance, reminding them that his power came not from them, but from God. One of Solomon's biggest tests came when a particularly sly jinn tried to challenge his authority. This jinn, known for its rebelliousness, refused to follow a direct order, trying to see how far Solomon's power went. Solomon, unbothered, recited a verse from the Holy Book, a passage that spoke of God's supremacy over everything. Immediately the jinn fell to its knees, overcome by the power of God's word. It was a reminder to everyone, including the jinn, that true authority belonged not to Solomon, but to the one God he served. Over time, Solomon became known not only for his power, but for inspiring others. Stories of his justice spread beyond his kingdom, reaching faraway lands where people saw him as a living legend. But for Solomon, being famous was never the point. His goal was clear: to guide his people to the truth, to show them that greatness is not about wealth or achievements, but about living according to God's principles. One evening, as he sat on his throne, looking at the horizon, Solomon thought about how fragile human life is. Despite everything he had accomplished, he knew his time in this world was limited. He remembered the words of his father, Prophet David, who had always taught him to stay humble before God. Solomon understood that his mission was not to gain earthly glory, but to prepare his people for a greater purpose, to recognize and serve the one true God. When the time came for him to leave this world, it was as quiet as his life had been extraordinary. It is said that Solomon, knowing his end was near, leaned on his staff and prayed silently. He remained there, firm and dignified, even in his last moments. The jinn, who were still working on his projects, didn't realize he had died until a small insect began to eat away at the staff, causing his body to fall. It was a powerful reminder that even the greatest are mortal, and a lesson for everyone. No one, no matter how wise or powerful, can escape God's call. Solomon's story continues to live on, not just as a tale of greatness, but as an example of how gifts, when used with fairness and humility, can change the world. His words, actions, and faith continue to inspire generations, reminding us that true power lies not in what we have, but in how we use it to serve a higher purpose. What does Solomon's life teach us? What would we do if we had his wisdom, his power, his gifts? Would we be fair, humble, and grateful as he was? Or would we forget where these gifts come from and what they are meant for? The story of the prophet Solomon is not just a story from the past, but a mirror in which we can all see ourselves, searching for answers to our own questions about justice, faith, and purpose.